Bon après-midi tout le monde. Good afternoon everybody. We will start. My name is Lucie Lamarche. I am a professor at the Faculty of Law here at U of Ottawa. I'm also the Gordon F. Anderson Chair in Human Rights and the Research Director of the Human Rights Center at University of Ottawa. C'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je vous souhaite la bienvenue, non seulement à l'audience physique, mais aussi à l'audience virtuelle, car nous avons une audience virtuelle cet après-midi, et il va de soi que je souhaite la plus chaleureuse des bienvenues à la Commission ontarienne des droits de la personne. Nous sommes ici pour célébrer le lancement du rapport que la Commission ontarienne des droits de la personne a complété suite à une importante consultation portant sur les troubles mentaux et les dépendances. Et je crois que l'écran fait état de la version anglaise de ce rapport, mais la version française est aussi disponible. Merci donc à toute l'équipe du Centre des droits de la personne ainsi qu'à celle de la Commission ontarienne des droits de la personne pour tous les efforts logistiques, techniques nécessaires à l'organisation de cet événement. So, as I said before, this event is being webcast. It means that we have other participants than those in the room. I guess it's good to note that the presentations, comments, and questions that take place today will be recorded and made available through the web. I want to take the opportunity just to go with a very short, welcoming editorial note this afternoon, and I think my point is to celebrate this collaboration between the Ontario Human Rights Commission and the Human Rights Center at U of O. It's kind of a cliche to say that we live in a complex world, and a complex word is by essence a word of collaboration. As some publicity said before, we've come a long way. I think it's no coincidence that all the speakers this afternoon are women. We've come a long way, but as this report shows, we can still do much better. Human rights are about values, dignity, autonomy, privacy, right to non-discrimination. But as my good friend Vincent Grisson from the other side of the river, he's an experienced worker with community in Gatineau and made a presentation at the Human Rights Center last week about human rights impact assessment, which is kind of dry and quantitative. But as Vincent was explaining so well, the only way to truly appreciate human value is to hear the stories of the people. And I believe this report that we are here to share this afternoon is a lot about the stories of the people. The Ontario Human Rights Commission went through a lengthy process, hearing over 1,500 individuals and receiving more or less 40 written submissions. This is a lot of voices. The experiences of the people were heard, and the report includes several recommendations for change. The changes proposed will be for the betterment of individuals with mental health issues and addictions, as well as for their families and for communities, which include the academic setting as an employer, an educational service provider, and an actor in the creation of new knowledge about complexity and complex issues. So again, welcome to the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Welcome to all of you, physically in the room or virtually with us. And it is really my pleasure to now pass the floor to Madam Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, Barbara Hall. Madam.
So thank you for being here at the University of Ottawa in partnership with the Human Rights Research and Education Center. And we're glad to have a new collaboration with you and look forward to many, many opportunities to work together. It's also great to be in this gorgeous space, and I'm wondering at any point if the organ is going to start to play. Today is World Mental Health Day, and around the world, that day is motivating people to come together and talk, to have conversations about mental health, something that has happened too rarely, talking openly about issues of mental health and addiction. And it's partially because of that attitude, the fear, the stigma, the hiding of mental health issues, that we started on this work at the Ontario Human Rights Commission that ultimately created a report called Minds That Matter, a report on our consultation across Ontario on human rights, mental health, and addictions. I'm going to give a brief overview of the report. Pascal Demers from the Commission will give a similar overview in French, and then we'll have a more detailed presentation from Nancy Austin, the Executive Director of the Commission. After that, we'll have an opportunity to hear from 3 representatives of organizations in the community who at the grassroots are working with people with mental health or addictions issues. And then we'll have an opportunity for questions and discussion. And there's some food at the back of the room, an opportunity to have a snack and network. As Lucy Lamarche said, when we went out to people in Ontario asking for people to share with us their experience of discrimination on the basis of mental illness or addictions, we got more response from any outreach we have done in, I guess you could say, the 50 years history of the Commission. As an aside, we're celebrating 50 years this year. So, although we knew anecdotally that many people, one, experienced mental health and addictions issues, but also that there were a lot of barriers and discrimination based on that, very few people actually came to the human rights system to make complaints or to raise mental health issues. We knew the issues were out there, we knew the discrimination was out there, and so we went out to say, share with us your experience. And the response was loud and big. Over the past 2 years of that process, we spoke with many different groups of people who all play a role in helping us define the problems and working towards solutions. We spoke with hundreds of people with psychiatric disabilities or addictions, with employers, housing providers, service organizations, with the healthcare sector, advocates, family members, and many other people. We held public and private sessions in North Bay, Ottawa, Windsor, and Toronto. We released a survey, did focus groups, and invited people to make written submissions. As Lucy said, we received over 1,500 verbal and written submissions from across Ontario. This report documents the experiences of discrimination, harassment, and other human rights concerns affecting Ontarians with psychiatric disabilities or addictions. At the same time, it was critical to us that our report reflect as many different sides of the issues as possible, since solutions have to come from many different players. We heard many different perspectives and different lived realities. The challenge was to have the report reflect these many different voices. But there's one thing that people had in common, no matter what their viewpoint or experience. Everyone who came forward didn't just talk about the problems. They also came to talk about solutions. We've done our best to capture these in the report's recommendations and commitments, which I'll talk about a bit later. We titled our report, Minds That Matter, because many people felt their perspectives and experiences were silenced, ignored, and made invisible because they have mental health disabilities or addictions. But people do matter, and people's concerns need to be taken seriously. People with mental health issues or addictions also contributed to the look and the feel of the book. We used artwork provided by Workman Arts, an organization that specializes in the arts and mental health. So there are pieces in the report by Emily Yang, Lavey, Pavel Janicek, Chris Crew, and Linda Foston. While we heard many different issues from many different perspectives, some common themes did emerge. For example, we heard that stereotypes and negative societal attitudes are embedded in some legislation, institutional policies, and practices, as well as individual attitudes. And we heard again and again how these attitudes are causing widespread discrimination in housing, employment, and services. We heard that many people with mental health or addictions issues don't know that the Human Rights Code gives them the right to be free from discrimination based on disability. Many others said they knew about their rights but didn't know how to assert them. And we heard that many organizations are not aware of how to apply the Human Rights Code to uphold the rights of people with mental health or addiction disabilities. Upholding these rights is a good thing to do. It's the right thing to do. But in Ontario, it's also the required thing to do. It's the law. We heard repeatedly, thank you, someone read my mind. We heard repeatedly about the need to respect people's dignity, privacy, and individual differences, to respect people's rights to autonomy and non-discrimination, and to the need to fully integrate people so they can make meaningful contributions to their community. In Ontario, many people with mental health issues or addictions live in poverty. We heard often how having a low income caused even more barriers to housing, to services, and to job opportunities. We heard about many issues that have been discussed before in other reports. But we also heard many new perspectives, offering ideas on what we could collectively do to advance human rights for people with mental health issues or addictions. It's a daunting task as there are so many areas that need work, and solutions won't come overnight. Many people across Ontario, some of whom we'll hear from today, are already hard at work to improve the daily reality for people with mental health issues or addictions. This report is designed to complement the work that's already being done and to add a human rights focus to some of the work that lies ahead. The report contains 54 recommendations for government, for employers, for housing providers, service providers, and other organizations. For example, we recommend that municipalities across Ontario review their zoning and housing licensing bylaws to make sure they don't treat housing for people with mental health issues or addictions any differently than other types of housing. We also call for the Government of Ontario to address its obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities to promote human rights and fundamental freedoms for all people with psychosocial disabilities. Among other things, this involves working with disability groups and other stakeholders to review and evaluate all laws, policies, and standards relating to mental health to ensure equity for people with psychiatric disabilities or addictions. Many people told us they were prevented from getting jobs or volunteer positions because past incidents where they were taken to hospital for mental health issues cropped up on police record checks. That's why we're recommending that the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police and other agencies actively promote their new police record check guidelines across police services, vulnerable sector agencies, and other employers, including the Government of Ontario. It would be easy for us to sit back and say that somebody else has to fix all the problems. But that's not the reality. In fact, we all have to share responsibility for how our society discriminates against people because of mental health or addictions. And we all have to share the work to change this. While we're looking at what people had to say, we were also looking at our work at the Ontario Human Rights Commission and asking ourselves what we could do to make change. And I'm very pleased that two of my fellow commissioners, Fernand Lalonde and Professor Errol Mendez from the University of Ottawa Law School, are here today. And they were part of the discussion of us asking ourselves what we could do to make change. The report includes 26 commitments that we at the Commission are making today to do our part to advance human rights for persons with mental health issues or addictions. For example, we commit to creating a policy on human rights, mental health, and addiction that will offer concrete steps for people and organizations across Ontario to eliminate the barriers and discrimination that are so common today. We will continue to provide education on human rights and the workplace to employers, employees, and unions, and will include a focus on human rights, mental health, and addictions. We'll continue to use our mandate to launch public interest inquiries We'll seek to intervene in cases, as we did in a case earlier this week in Hamilton, where the council voted against housing for 8 young women with mental health issues. The Commission is intervened and will be at the Ontario Municipal Board arguing against the action of the Council and, in fact, of the actual wording of the bylaw. We will, in other cases as well, launch Commission interventions or initiate our own applications to actively challenge cases where we think doctors are denying services to people based on mental health or addiction disabilities without good reason. We will invite a provincial psychiatric institution as well as other partners with human rights expertise in mental health, including consumer survivor organizations, to take part in a large-scale organizational change process to address any human rights concerns in the way they deliver service. And we will continue to actively challenge discriminatory neighborhood opposition to housing for people with mental health issues or addictions. This will involve working with municipal councils, conducting public interest inquiries, pursuing legal challenges, and taking other steps to make people feel truly at home. These are just a few of the many commitments we're making to make human rights a lived reality for people with mental health issues or addictions. At this point, I'd like to invite up Pascal Demers from the Human Rights Commission, who will make comments about the report in French. Thank you, Pascal.
Bonjour. Bienvenue et merci de vous être rejoints à nous pour le lancement de Parce, qu'on importe, le rapport de la Commission ontarienne des droits de la personne sur sa consultation sur les droits de la personne, la maladie mentale et les dépendances. Ce rapport fait état de ce que révèle la plus vaste consultation de notre histoire. Nous avons discuté avec des centaines de personnes aux prises avec des troubles psychiques ou des dépendances, des personnes qui interviennent en leur nom et des membres de leur famille, des employeurs, des fournisseurs de logements, des organisations de services, des représentants du secteur de la santé et bien d'autres. Nous avons reçu plus de 1500 observations orales ou écrites partout en Ontario. Nous avons intitulé notre rapport « Parce qu'on importe » puisque beaucoup de personnes ont l'impression que la société passe sous silence leur vécu ou en fait fi parce qu'elles ont des troubles mentaux ou des dépendances. Or, les gens importent et leurs préoccupations doivent être prises au sérieux. Bien que des gens d'horizons variés nous aient fait part d'une grande variété de préoccupations, certains thèmes récurrents sont ressortis de la consultation. Par exemple, nous avons entendu à maintes reprises que des stéréotypes et des attitudes sociétales négatives sont profondément ancrées dans les lois, politiques et pratiques organisationnelles et attitudes personnelles, ce qui mène à de la discrimination courante en matière de logement, d'emploi et de services. Nous avons appris que beaucoup de personnes aux prises avec des problèmes de santé mentale ou des dépendances ne savent pas qu'elles ont le droit de vivre à l'abri de la discrimination fondée sur le handicap ou comment faire valoir ce droit. Enfin, on nous a dit que beaucoup d'organisations ne savent pas comment appliquer le Code des droits de la personne pour respecter les droits des personnes aux prises avec des troubles mentaux ou des dépendances. Le respect des droits de ces personnes est une bonne affaire, c'est l'affaire à faire. En Ontario, c'est également ce qu'exige la loi. Partout en Ontario, des gens travaillent déjà très fort pour améliorer la réalité quotidienne des personnes ayant des problèmes de santé mentale ou des dépendances. Nous avons produit ce rapport pour compléter les travaux déjà entrepris et examiner la situation sous l'angle des droits de la personne dans le but d'orienter les travaux futurs. Le rapport contient 54 recommandations à l'intention du gouvernement, des employeurs, des fournisseurs de logements et de services et d'autres organisations. Par exemple, nous recommandons aux municipalités de l'ensemble de l'Ontario de passer en revue le règlement de zonage et règlement sur les permis autorisant les logements locatifs pour veiller à ce qu'ils ne réservent pas un traitement particulier aux logements pour personnes aux prises avec des problèmes de santé mentale ou des dépendances comparativement aux autres types de logements. En plus d'écouter ce que les gens avaient à dire, nous nous sommes penchés sur notre travail à la Commission ontarienne des droits de la personne pour savoir ce que nous pouvons faire pour apporter un changement. Le rapport inclut 26 engagements que nous prenons aujourd'hui pour contribuer à la promotion des droits de la personne aux prises avec des problèmes de santé mentale ou des dépendances. Par exemple, nous nous engageons à créer une politique relative aux droits de la personne, à la maladie mentale et aux dépendances qui donnera aux citoyens et organisations de l'ensemble de l'Ontario des moyens concrets d'éliminer les obstacles et de lutter contre la discrimination qui sont si répandues de nos jours. Nous inviterons aussi un établissement psychiatrique provincial ainsi que d'autres partenaires spécialisés dans les droits de la personne de la santé mentale, y compris des organisations d'usagers et de survivants, à participer à un processus de changement organisationnel d'envergure pour donner suite aux questions de droits de la personne que soulève la prestation de services. L'élimination des obstacles auxquels se heurtent les personnes aux prises avec des problèmes de santé mentale ou des dépendances est un projet de taille. Nous nous employons à changer des attitudes, des approches qui ont cours depuis très, très longtemps. Le mouvement des usagers et des survivants et les personnes aux prises avec des dépendances qui continuent à revendiquer l'équité sont des moteurs de changement. Ils doivent participer aux efforts déployés pour apporter un changement systémique réel. Les gouvernements, les organisations de services, les employeurs, les fournisseurs de logements et les autres groupes ont également un rôle à jouer lorsqu'il s'agit de changer les politiques, les pratiques, la loi et bien sûr les attitudes. Il incombe à chacun de nous d'apporter aujourd'hui les changements requis pour créer un monde meilleur demain. Ce rapport prépare le terrain pour que nous puissions agir sur de nombreux fronts, une étape à la fois. Merci.
Merci, Pascal. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Nancy Austin, who will give some more details on the report. Nancy has been the Executive Director of the Ontario Human Rights Commission since September 2004. Throughout her career, both at and before going to the Commission, Nancy has worked on social justice issues, including legal aid reform, access to justice, and employment law reforms. Please welcome Nancy Austin.
Thank you, Barbara. What I'm going to present is what we heard in the consultation that we undertook. I want to start off by identifying the role of the Ontario Human Rights Commission in the province of Ontario. We are an independent statutory agency, arm's length from government. Our purpose is to promote, protect, and advance human rights across Ontario, as set out in the Human Rights Code. The Code gives us the power to do a number of things to promote and protect human rights. It includes educating the public, developing policies, such as the one that we're going to develop on mental health, providing guidance for complying with the Code, reviewing legislation. Laws can build in systemic barriers, and if we review them before they become laws, we can perhaps change them for the better before they're implemented. We can also review bills, policies, and programs to see if they create barriers and if they're consistent with the Code. We also do public interest inquiries. That doesn't mean answering the phone. It means doing inquiries into issues in society that could be contravening the code and proposing solutions, or if necessary, taking it to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario or some other court. We seek legal remedies in the public interest, either through complaints or interventions at the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, or, for example, this year we've been 3 times to the Supreme Court of Canada on competing rights issues or other issues based on code grounds. It's all fun work. We're just one part of the human rights system in Ontario. As I said, there's the Human Rights Tribunal, a very important body that takes individual complaints of people who believe they've been discriminated against, and the Human Rights Legal Support Centre, which helps people who make human rights claims. Each of these agents is independent of government, although we all are funded by government. The code protects people based on, whoops, have I gone? Oh, that's right. The report talks about people's human rights concerns, specifically mental health and addictions. We have policies on many other areas, and if you go to our website, you'll find the link on the back of the policy. You'll see that we have it covering basically all the major code grounds. It protects people from discrimination based on 17 grounds, and we're really pleased that in June of this year, gender identity and gender expression were added. That's been a long-fought battle, and we welcome the addition to those under the code. The code protects people in 5 social areas. It includes housing, in your workplace, in receiving goods, services, and facilities, when making contracts, and being a member of a union or a vocational association. Because of the number of human rights concerns raised in the consultation, we focus specifically on the ones that impacted people in their day-to-day lives. Rental housing, work, and services. The services include policing, health care, education, prisons, insurance, child welfare, and a few others. The purpose of the consultation was to listen and then to report on what we heard. The policy will flow from that, but we have to hear from people, and as they said, nothing about us without us. We asked people to identify the types of barriers that people experienced in these areas, and we asked them for solutions. Sometimes there were no solutions, but if you start talking about an issue, the solutions sometimes come. It was important to understand the issues and concerns of people with mental health and addictions issues in their own voices, but there are also many community organizations that helped as well. About 2/3 of the respondents were people with mental health and addictions issues, around 1,000 of the people. It was important to reach out to organizations who work with or provide services to people as well. It included housing providers, employers, and many different service providers, advocates, and their families. As with any consultation, there are limits. You can't reach everyone. There's always people who we would want to reach out to and perhaps couldn't, or who were not ready to become involved. Some perspectives were not as well represented as others. For example, we didn't hear from as many employers as we had hoped, and yet that is where a lot of the issues that we heard about occur in the workplace. However, as we develop our policy, we are inviting feedback from the public on what we heard, so we're still hoping to hear from anyone who wishes to. Throughout the consultation, we heard again and again that people weren't aware of what their human rights were. This includes their rights under the Human Rights Code in Ontario, but also broader rights, such as the right of capable people not to consent to treatment if they don't want to. People also told us of concerns about rights that were broader than freedom from discrimination. For example, they talked about societal factors like homelessness and unemployment. These may not be direct grounds under the code, but they certainly impact on people who are protected under the code. So we had to listen to that and needed to listen to that as well to see if we could draw links, to see if we could find intersections between code grounds and other societal factors. We wanted to make sure these experiences were represented and to draw links to the human rights protections under the Code, but also in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and under international covenants. So we outline people's rights under the Code in the report, and we also cover the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the UN Convention, United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Canada ratified in the year 2010. In ratifying the Convention, Canada agreed to take progressive steps to uphold the rights and fundamental freedoms of all people with disabilities on an equal basis with others. These include rights to accessible facilities, rights to equal recognition before the law, rights to live independently and be included in the community, and rights to an adequate standard of living and social protection. We need to keep pushing to ensure that Canada lives up to its obligations under the UN Convention. Sometimes it's easy to sign a piece of paper and more difficult to actually put it into action. The Canadian Association of Statutory Human Rights Agencies, known as CASHRA as its acronym, of which the Ontario Human Rights Commission is a member, has called on all levels of government to fulfill their obligations under the Convention. So here's some of what we heard. We can't have all of it up. You'd be here all day, all night, all week. But it's important that the stories themselves get out there. One of the major themes was stereotyping. People reported widespread stereotyping based on assumptions about what people with mental health and addiction disabilities are like. Stereotyping is linked directly to denial of housing, jobs, and services. Organizations can also develop policies or practices that unexpectedly or unintentionally have a negative impact on people with psychosocial disabilities. This, again, increases or reinforces stereotypes. We often heard about people stereotyped as being a risk to other people because of their mental health disability. There's fear built in that needn't be there. We heard this stereotype is linked to municipal laws that Barbara was talking about that enforce discriminatory zoning, NIMBYism, as the acronym is often used. People with drug addictions or schizophrenia experience even more negative attitudes from others based on assumption of risk. The stereotypes about mental health may affect people of different code-protected groups in different ways. For example, transgender participants told us that trans people, because of their gender identity, are automatically, by some, perceived to have mental health issues. Why? Another common stereotype we heard is that people are assumed not to be able to make informed choices for themselves if they have a psychosocial disability, and people's experiences or perspectives are minimized by others and assumed to have very little credibility. We heard people use language like, "Nobody cares," "I'm irrelevant," "My words will be discounted," "I don't matter," when telling their stories. It was hard to hear. People also were thought to have brought disabilities on themselves or to have less legitimacy than people with physical disabilities. You go into a hospital and you're treated immediately for your physical disability. You go in with a mental health issue and a physical disability at the same time. They may not treat you in the same way, and we heard it time and time again. A large number of people pointed out the role of the media in shaping public opinion and in perpetuating stereotypes about mental health. More education is clearly needed in all areas about mental health and people's human rights, and education will not be enough. We also need to enforce these rights. One of the impacts of stereotyping is that people often fear telling others about their disability. This can lead to further barriers in housing, employment, or services. For example, one person who spoke to us quit their job as a librarian instead of asking for a needed leave of absence because of the fear of encountering stigma. This was not the only person who raised that issue. We heard, I got this now? Yes. We heard repeatedly that people with mental health or addictions face higher rates of poverty and low income compared to people without disabilities or people with other types of disabilities. And in fact, we're doing a study based on StatsCan data that reinforces this, and we'll be publishing it next year. We heard that discrimination in employment, education, and housing contributes to people having low income and fewer life choices. Poverty, in turn, leads to further experiences of discrimination and social exclusion. People with mental health or addiction issues stated how they had great difficulty obtaining safe, affordable, and adequate housing. Because of the costs of housing, some people had to wait for years on social housing waiting lists or leave their community of choice to find housing, and that takes away social supports, which can sometimes exacerbate the situation. Or they had to live in supportive housing when they could live more independently. Many lived in substandard housing because that's all they could afford. People with mental health or addiction issues have also been negatively affected by policies and practices which can disadvantage people who are poor and, again, can be linked as a form of discrimination. What if you can't afford a phone and yet the only access is through a telephone number? What if you have to file a human rights complaint or need to, want to, and the forms themselves are more complex than you can manage at the moment without assistance from someone else? This prevents access to justice, and in a democracy, that shouldn't be allowed to be happening. Many people in the consultation received some form of social assistance and told us that after receiving the social assistance and paying rent, they had very little left over for basic needs. Some suggested social assistance rates must be increased to ensure people can afford the necessities of life, or change the system so it's more supportive. Some said, and some of us may agree, that Canada is not meeting its obligations under the international agreements to ensure everyone can realize their rights to income security and rights to housing. Okay. I'm just going to see where I am here. Okay. We often talk about intersecting code grounds, and that means when you have several grounds working together. You may be of a racialized background with a disability, you may be of a certain sexual orientation tied to age, an age-based ground, so that they're called intersecting grounds. And so we learned about the links between discrimination based on mental health or addictions and how it relates to other forms of discrimination. The stress can be caused by discrimination based on race, discrimination because of the immigration experience, or because of being harassed because of sexual orientation. And all of these can lead to poorer mental health. We also heard discrimination based on mental health or addictions will look unique when combined with other forms of discrimination. And an example is we heard stereotypes about Aboriginal people and drug and alcohol use. One Aboriginal woman told us she was stopped by police in her car and harshly questioned about using alcohol. It was only when a white passenger beside her explained where they were going that they were let go. Some people reported landlords turning down people for private rental housing when they learned they were on Ontario Disability Support Program. And that often relates to their mental health disability. Some women talked about experiences of sexual assault or harassment linked to them having a mental health history, for example, in a hospital. One woman reported that when she complained about sexual harassment, she was told by hospital staff it was all part of her illness. Forms of discrimination. Even though many housing providers, service providers, and employers practice human rights as best they can and have policies or practices to address the needs of people with mental health issues or addictions, there are still many concerns raised about different types of discrimination in these areas. For example, there's direct discrimination, and direct discrimination is when people with addictions or mental health issues are turned away from physical health care services because they are presumed to be drug-seeking or for other reasons related to their disabilities. One person told us about going to a hospital with severe abdominal pain. She was left in 10 hours alone in the hospital after they found out she was being treated with methadone replacement therapy. So they made an assumption about her based on another aspect of her health. The person fainted from the pain, and the doctors then decided she actually needed surgery. We also heard that people can be profiled as a security risk because of a mental health issue or addiction, even if there's little or no evidence of risk. One service provider was concerned about a hospital's practice of making sure security personnel were always present if a patient's file indicated mental health issues. People were also concerned about police reacting more forcefully than they need to when approaching people experiencing a mental health crisis. And that's been in the papers a lot over the past while, starting with Robert Jakinski. I'm sure there were before that as well. But it's something that needs to be addressed and that many police forces and security forces are trying to, but it's hard. We heard about employers and others failing to accommodate people's disabilities. One person said her employer didn't believe that mental health issues were real disabilities that required accommodation. She was told to take the job or resign if she couldn't handle it. Harassment is another huge issue for people with mental health disabilities. This includes unwelcome comments or actions relating to their disabilities, intrusive questions, excessive demands for medical information, social isolation, and even assault or sexual assault. Some people experienced what could be called a poisoned environment, where one comment or action was so severe it left them unable to participate at work. One woman told us that her surgeon, who had just operated on her, said, "Had I known you were crazy, I wouldn't have operated on you." People also reported how certain policies and practices, even though neutral on their face, may have negative effects on people with mental health or addiction issues. For example, employers often look to see if there's a gap in someone's employment history and may then not hire them. But what if you were in hospital? What if you were seeking treatment? This indirectly affects you. We also heard how many mental health agencies or services lack cultural competency, where their practices, policies, or culture don't recognize or respond to specific needs of marginalized communities. This can lead to people from these communities being systemically excluded. This is a type of systemic discrimination. An example is a lack of inclusive environment in different mental health facilities could lead people who are gay, lesbian, or bisexual not to disclose their sexual orientation and thus not be able to access these services equally. Understanding the duty to accommodate is incredibly important. Individuals and organizations, I have one, thanks. That's lovely, thanks you. Actually, I will take a pause. Individuals and organizations told us they had difficulty understanding their duty to accommodate. How do I do it? It's not the same one-size-fits-all. It's not an easy process. You have to work, you have to understand, listen. However, it's a legal duty of an organization to change their practices, rules, and standards so that people protected by the code, that's all of us, but people with specific issues protected by the code can access the services equally. We heard that much more guidance is needed in this area, particularly on how to ask or what to ask and what accommodations are appropriate. Organizations also identified the need for more information on how to balance a person's need for accommodation when it could conflict with others' rights or needs. And we have also done a policy on competing rights, which is also on our website, which addresses this issue specifically, how you balance different rights. For example, social and private housing providers told us they needed clarity on how to accommodate a tenant when hoarding is part of their disability, as this could be creating health and safety hazards for others in the housing community. We heard that organizations are not designed to take the needs of people with mental health or addictions disabilities into account up front. I mentioned that some application forms are long, complex, or intrusive, or they're very difficult to be completed. We heard that even despite the requirements of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, service organizations are unsure how their services should be made more inclusive and accessible, especially for people with mental health disabilities or addictions. We also heard concerns about the need to pay more attention to the principles of accommodation. And they're really important. Dignity, privacy and confidentiality. An employer doesn't have the right to see your medical records, as we heard many had been asked. Respect for people's autonomy. Don't assume that they aren't able to give instructions or communicate their needs. Respond to their individual needs. Don't do a cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all. It doesn't work. We're all individuals. We all have our different needs. And respect full inclusion. We heard about how some people experienced shunning at work when they came back after a mental health disability-related leave, with colleagues or co-workers not speaking to them anymore. Other concerns were raised, and I'm really skimming over the surface, and it may seem like I'm not, but there was lots. We heard specific concerns about the mental health sector, including about the lack of appropriate and coordinated mental health services for different groups. It's a special concern for people who are in the correctional system or those who are released from prison. We also heard about the specific concerns in the mental health system, including inappropriate use of restraints, the impact of labeling people, harassment, people not being asked to provide input into their care, and treatment without informed consent. One person said her son was kept in physical restraints for 8 hours and not let out to use the washroom. And people said they had difficulty enforcing their rights. Because of factors relating to their disabilities, they said the complaint system are hard to navigate, and this needs to be changed. Finally, individuals identified the need for advocates to help them navigate systems. People may risk losing services or housing if they make complaints on their own and aren't aware of all the processes. Advocacy is an important form of human support, but it also points out to a systemic barrier. Organizations must remove barriers up front to simplify processes so everyone can access their services equitably. In the report, there are 54 recommendations, and they're all to parties that we believe have an interest in or are responsible for making changes in these areas. Education must be provided. We need to develop human rights policies and procedures, and enhance those that already exist. We need to remove specific barriers that have been identified or that will be identified that cause specific human rights concerns. For example, we recommend that all service organizations review and remove barriers for participation for people from all code groups, including where policies and practices exclude people based on race, sex, gender identity, age, Aboriginal identity, or sexual orientation, among others. In the case of government, we also provide recommendations to address societal issues that give rise to discrimination, to respond to people's broader human rights, and to fulfill the requirements of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We aren't going to say, we've heard it all, you guys go away and do it. We also have to do our own work. We commit to undertake 26 activities, often in partnership with others, but we'll push them along. Clearly, we have to develop a policy that addresses the issues and gives guidance to people, telling them what their rights and obligations are. We need to seek partnerships, and we've already identified a mental health hospital and a university who want to take part in organizational change to address human rights concerns. We're going to use the functions of our mandate given to us under the Code, including public interest inquiries and legal functions, to challenge human rights concerns when we hear about them. For example, where doctors allegedly turn away patients based on stereotypes about mental health or addictions, that they're difficult patients to have. We'll continue to raise concerns with responsible bodies. So, for example, some feared employers would improperly disclose mental health issues to other workers because of the changes to the Occupational Health and Safety Act that occurred recently. And we're going to be discussing those with the ministry and make clear what the employer can and cannot share when you're balancing the health rights of one group with the potential safety rights of another group. We can see if the Act can be monitored to see if it is having a negative impact on people with mental health or addiction disabilities. And we will continue to help other organizations where we can to meet the recommendations that we have made. So we hope that this report will raise awareness and discussion and make clear the links between mental health, addictions, and human rights. And later in the program, we'll take questions. But at this point, I'm turning it over to Barbara to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. We did hear a lot. And now we're delighted to welcome Bridget Renaud, who is chair of the Client Empowerment Council at the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre. And as a person who has experienced addiction, brings us the important perspective of a consumer survivor. Welcome, Bridget.
And I thank you at the same time for the opportunity to help me find my voice. I am a survivor. There really isn't any other way to describe what my life experiences are. I survived home, foster care, mental, physical, and emotional abuse. I survived the trauma of sexual abuse from childhood to adolescence, then into adulthood. I am a survivor. I was born in a dysfunctional home and then went into foster care system with my younger brother. It was there that I was physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually abused as well. My culture was taken away from me. And when I turned 5, I became responsible to care for the other children, feeding, dressing, and cleaning them. I was always the last to bathe. And the bathroom was where I was sexually abused as well. It wasn't until recently when I became capable of taking a bath again, sometimes 2 times a day. I suffered from bedwetting as well, and my foster care family would hit me every morning to set the example for the others. to follow the rules. My mother rescued us when I was 10, and we ran to Winnipeg with her then partner. This was an improvement from the foster home, but still had challenges as my mother's alcoholism was in full active mode. I became my brother's caregiver and was trapped in an extended family. I was expected to clean up, particularly after the parents' and families' parties, where I had been subjected to numerous sexual assaults from multiple abusers. It was during this time that I learned to keep secrets. It is now that I talk about these secrets. I didn't know that this lifestyle was any different from any other, so I tried to fit in and belong, and living a life I thought was normal. Growing up in an environment that was filled with alcoholism and addiction, I was determined to stay away from booze and drugs, but the addiction is a subtle disease. I started smoking when I was 10. Then, due to peer pressure, began smoking marijuana, and soon afterwards began my drinking career, which escalated into harder drugs. I became a full-blown addict, willing to do anything to get my fix, by doing things I would not normally do, and further developing my survival skills. I was trapped in a cycle of knowing I had to stop, but not being able to, and I became one of those. Trying to give closure to these events has been and continues to be a challenge. In recent years, I've tried to take advantage of the justice system to allow me to have access to much-needed services and benefits, but because these events occurred in many jurisdictions, it is difficult to get the various provincial authorities to cooperate with one another. The report by the Human Rights Commission touches on these conflicting rights, and hopefully some action will be taken to ease the burden from people like me. All I need is cooperation. I am now over 5 years clean and sober. My journey into recovery has been weighed down with barriers and the insidious nature of addiction. After several attempts at rehab, I finally have hope. Looking back, I realize how dysfunctional my life was and has been, and the path to normalcy is difficult and long. I want to have a normal life, and staying clean and sober is essential to any progress I make. I'm a single mother whose daughter became my caregiver, and recovery has not only given her back to me, it frees her to have her own life. We sometimes struggle in our new roles, but we are together, and my family's cycle of alcoholism, drug addiction, and abuse has a better chance of stopping now than ever before. One of the many reasons for my recovery, and the one that gives me more strength to continue, is to help our young people from living the life I lived. As my journey into recovery continues, I'm developing the knowledge and skill I need to ensure they have the opportunities I never did. But stigma stands in the way. Not only was I victimized by my abusers, I also carried the stigma of being a survivor and all its manifestations. As an alcoholic and drug user, I was treated as a lesser person and believed that what was being said about me was in fact who I was. I have worn many masks my whole life just to hide from the looks and comments, knowing that I am being judged and labeled. My recovery has been easier because I have stable housing, so my daughter was able to return to a home. I've taken many risks these past 5 years, and each a battle against self-stigmatization and being stigmatized. I returned to school and I gained skills to find work and some financial independence. I'm using these new skills as chair of the Client Empowerment Council, the Royal, whose main role is to destigmatize mental illness and addiction, but along the way I am treated as an equal, as a person. This is exciting yet scary, but is giving me the self-confidence I need to help our youth. Many experiences may be traumatic, and I wouldn't want anyone to have the life I lived. I had, but I'm using them as a source of strength and purpose by sharing these experiences with you today and with our young people. My hope is that it will give them the strength to speak out and get the help that they need. I understand their challenges and hopelessness of growing up in an environment where people are not a person, where we are not a person, but a possession. I understand how others may perceive us as a result of our experiences, but I also know there is hope and help. Without the support from the Children's Aid Society, I wouldn't have my daughter back. Willis College was supportive of the challenges I experienced when I went back to school and helped me complete my studies. I attended, and I'm just going to add a little something here. Who knew I had a brain? Not me. I graduated with an 87 at the age of 46, so that was great. I attended community support groups whose members have lived the life I have and guided me to recovery. Not only do I volunteer work at the Royal, I continue to receive service from them as an outpatient. It's still difficult for me to comprehend how I can be a client and a leader at the Royal, but the support I receive from everyone has been a tremendous boost to my self-esteem. I'm now a believer that stigma can be overcome, that it's not only my job to fight, it's everyone's. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Bridget, for your strength and your courage in coming here and sharing with all of us your story, your pain, and your hope. And I think most wonderful in your words is the hope that you now have and the hope that you share with us as we all work together to address issues such as those that you've lived. Thank you. The next person I'm pleased to introduce is Michelle Veillette, who is Director of the Psychosocial Readaptation Programs and Clinical Services for Montfort Renaissance. Michelle has 17 years' experience working in mental health and social services with Ottawa's Francophone community. Welcome.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. J'aimerais commencer mon élocution en remerciant Barbara Hall et Nancy Austin de la Commission pour avoir instigé les travaux sur cette consultation auprès des personnes ayant des troubles de santé mentale et les dépendances. J'aimerais remercier aussi Lucie Lamarche de l'Université d'Ottawa pour sa participation active à cet événement d'une grande importance pour notre communauté. J'aimerais prendre un moment pour apporter à votre attention la très belle contribution des artistes dans le rapport Parce, qu'on importe, qui ont rendu possible l'embellissement du rapport. Donc, j'aimerais renommer les travaux, les œuvres d'art saisissantes d'Emily Hang, Lindsay Vey, Pavel Janacek, Chris Crewen, Linda Foston. Donc, bravo. Par la même occasion, je souhaite souligner l'importance des initiatives artistiques pour les personnes qui ont un trouble de santé mentale tel que Workman Arts de Toronto. Merci, ça ouvre la voie au rétablissement. Il me fait plaisir au nom de Montfort Renaissance de prendre part au lancement du rapport de la consultation portant sur les droits des personnes aux prises avec la maladie mentale et les dépendances en cette journée mondiale de la santé mentale. Montfort Renaissance œuvre depuis 25 ans au sein de la communauté franco-ontarienne à offrir différentes ressources aux personnes aux prises avec la maladie mentale et les dépendances en soutenant la réponse à leurs besoins en matière de logement, de soins de santé, de soutien judiciaire, d'emploi, d'expression artistique, d'entraide par les pairs et la gestion du sevrage. C'est avec enthousiasme que nous avons participé à la consultation de la Commission afin de contribuer à l'identification des facteurs qui empêchent les personnes de participer pleinement à la vie sociale, culturelle et économique de l'Ontario. On est fiers d'appuyer la priorité stratégique en santé mentale de la Commission afin d'enrayer la discrimination et le harcèlement qui persistent à l'endroit des personnes que nous desservons. Nous souhaitons souligner l'importance du travail de consultation mené par la Commission des droits de la personne. Donc, parmi les 1500 personnes qui ont participé au sondage, on est heureux de savoir que 1000 d'entre elles se sont dévoilées en termes ayant un trouble de la santé mentale, ce qui, pour nous, est la représentation de l'expression du pouvoir et la reprise du pouvoir personnel. De ce nombre, nous devons supposer que 17% de représentation des francophones s'applique à l'échantillon des voix sondées. En tant qu'employeur et prestataire de services d'un organisme sans but lucratif, je suis ravie de savoir que cette vaste consultation orientera le travail futur de la Commission et conduira à l'adoption d'une politique sur les droits de la personne pour dicter des mesures exemplaires pour les employeurs, les propriétaires, les fournisseurs de services et les particuliers en matière d'égalité pour tous les Ontariens. Donc, j'invite les décideurs, les législateurs et les institutions publiques et privées à tous les niveaux à joindre cet effort concerté dans le but d'enrayer les attitudes discriminatoires, d'assurer la reddition de comptes, de sensibiliser les gens, les organisations et le grand public aux droits et responsabilités établis dans le Code des droits de la personne. En fait, saviez-vous que 20% des Canadiens seront affectés personnellement par un problème de santé mentale à un moment donné dans leur vie? Et chaque jour, près de 500 000 Canadiens sont absents du travail à cause de problèmes de santé mentale. La maladie mentale affecte indirectement l'ensemble des Canadiens par le biais de la maladie mentale d'un parent, d'un proche, d'un collègue. 34 milliards est le coût de la santé mentale et de la toxicomanie sur l'économie de l'Ontario. La maladie mentale affecte des personnes de tous les âges, de tous les niveaux d'éducation et de toutes les classes sociales et de toutes les cultures. Les causes de la maladie mentale sont une interaction complexe de facteurs génétiques, biologiques, environnementaux et de la personnalité. On peut se rétablir d'un problème de santé mentale. La stigmatisation de la maladie mentale fait obstacle important non seulement au diagnostic et au traitement, mais aussi à l'acceptation de la personne dans la communauté. Le gouvernement de l'Ontario a certes fait des efforts depuis l'époque de la désinstitutionnalisation des années 1980, en octroyant du financement et en dictant un cadre de prestation des services de santé mentale. Toutefois, on sait très bien que malgré ces efforts, la stigmatisation, les stéréotypes sociaux et les obstacles au rétablissement en milieu communautaire demeurent encore très présents en Ontario. Donc, à la lumière des consultations menées par la Commission, on apprend qu'il existe effectivement un malaise social à l'endroit des Ontariens et des Ontariennes qui vivent avec une maladie mentale et une dépendance. Le personnel de Montfort Renaissance côtoie quotidiennement des gens empreints d'espoir, de volonté de se rétablir, des gens courageux, qui viennent chercher de l'aide dont ils ont besoin pour se représenter adéquatement dans la communauté auprès des propriétaires, des employeurs et des prestataires de services. En 2012, ces gens doivent encore se munir de force et de détermination pour affronter les perceptions d'autrui à l'effet qu'ils sont dangereux pour leur entourage, qu'ils sont de mauvais payeurs et qu'ils manquent de volonté pour s'en sortir. Nous supportons la recommandation de la Commission à l'effet que les prestataires de services doivent développer davantage de campagnes de sensibilisation du public pour contrer la stigmatisation envers les personnes. Nous sommes heureux de savoir que la Commission s'engagera à collaborer avec les organismes à l'éducation publique et qu'elle sera disposée à former les organismes publics et privés à sa future politique pour contrer la discrimination et le harcèlement envers les personnes. Sur le plan du statut socio-économique, nous observons régulièrement comment la discrimination fondée sur le handicap en matière de logement, d'éducation et d'emploi contribue à la limitation des choix de vie conduisant à la pauvreté. Les utilisateurs de services de Montfort Renaissance ont appris récemment que le fonds de démarrage de la prestation ontarienne de soutien pour les personnes handicapées serait éliminé à partir de janvier 2013. Ce montant, ce fonds de démarrage pour la vie en appartement, qui représente une somme de près de 800 $, remis à une personne à faible revenu, lui assure tout juste les fonds nécessaires pour se meubler et assurer les frais relatifs à son déménagement. Nous sommes d'avis que le gouvernement de l'Ontario devrait bonifier et améliorer l'aide sociale, ce qui comprend la révision et l'amélioration des prestations offertes pour veiller à ce que la population puisse se procurer les articles de première nécessité dont elle a besoin, comme la nourriture, des vêtements, un toit adéquat, des médicaments. Le manque d'options en matière de logement abordable, sécuritaire et dans des environnements sains contribue au maintien de l'itinérance, aux rechutes sur le plan de la santé mentale et des dépendances, à la judiciarisation et à la diminution du bien-être et de la qualité de vie. La sensibilisation de la population, le changement de loi, les politiques, c'est une responsabilité partagée entre les gouvernements, les fournisseurs de logements, les employeurs et les autres parties. Il apparaît nécessaire que le gouvernement de l'Ontario adopte de nouvelles options en matière de logement, comme l'augmentation des allocations au logement pour permettre aux personnes à faible revenu de choisir leur milieu de vie pour qu'ils favorisent leur rétablissement. Le gouvernement de l'Ontario et les municipalités doivent envisager des mesures inclusives de zonage, comme le suggère la Commission, qui obligeraient les promoteurs et les municipalités à réserver un pourcentage de nouvelles unités de logement abordables aux personnes aux prises avec un trouble de santé mentale et des dépendances. En ce qui a trait à la santé des femmes, nous croyons que notre collaboration citoyenne est primordiale au développement des communautés inclusives afin d'encourager les femmes monoparentales avec un trouble de santé mentale à utiliser les services dont elles ont besoin. Comme la Commission le mentionnait, elles craignent, en utilisant les services, de se faire enlever leur enfant. C'est en bâtissant des milieux inclusifs que nous pouvons favoriser la santé mentale des générations futures. Il a été mentionné par plusieurs intervenants et organismes consultés le manque de mesures d'adaptation aux besoins linguistiques qui affectent la qualité des soins et des services offerts à notre population. Cela finit par coûter plus cher sur l'ensemble de notre société. Par exemple, on apprend que les personnes hospitalisées qui ne sont pas servies en français sont mal évaluées, faute de pouvoir se faire comprendre par le personnel qui n'est pas bilingue. Le réseau des services de santé en français de l'Est de l'Ontario faisait d'ailleurs observer à la Commission le manque important de services en santé mentale pour les Franco-Ontariens. À titre d'employeur et de prestataire de services de soutien en employabilité, Montfort Renaissance accueille favorablement l'engagement de la Commission à élaborer une politique et des directives concernant l'obligation d'accommodement pour les employeurs. Nous croyons que le travail concerté de la Commission et des organismes publics et privés permettra de développer les connaissances nécessaires pour exercer leur devoir d'accommodement et d'enrichir les pratiques inclusives en milieu de travail. Nous invitons tous les employeurs ontariens à se prévaloir de mesures d'accommodement afin de contribuer à enrayer la peur de la stigmatisation au travail, ce qui engendre des démissions plutôt que des demandes d'accommodement, comme le mentionnait Barbara plus tôt. Nous souhaitons aussi inviter le gouvernement ontarien à chapeauter la collaboration et les efforts des employeurs en lançant des mesures incitatives d'inclusion des personnes aux prises avec la maladie mentale et les dépendances. Montfort Renaissance supporte les démarches de la coalition sur la vérification des dossiers de police et nous demandons à la police d'Ottawa de revoir sa politique de vérification des casiers judiciaires afin de ne pas porter préjudice aux droits des personnes qui ont reçu une évaluation psychiatrique au terme de la loi sur la santé mentale. Nous sommes d'accord avec l'idée que l'Association des chefs de police de l'Ontario et les autres organismes devraient promouvoir la mise en œuvre d'une directive sur la vérification des casiers judiciaires. Pour conclure, j'aimerais rappeler l'importance de travailler en synergie avec les mouvements de personnes utilisatrices de services afin de rester au fait du changement de l'état de la situation sur la discrimination et le harcèlement envers les personnes vivant avec un trouble de santé mentale. Mon Fonds Renaissance aimerait aussi exprimer sa reconnaissance quant à l'engagement de la Commission pour collaborer à l'amélioration de l'éducation publique et à travailler avec les groupes d'utilisateurs de services pour sensibiliser les différents ordres professionnels et pour surveiller les enjeux émergents. Merci.
Thank you, Michelle. So much to do, but great partners to do it with. To all of you out watching this on webcast, as well as those here, Renee Ouimet is the final speaker. Renee is the director of the Capacity Building and Education Division at the Canadian Mental Health Association, Ottawa branch. She has a Master's of Social Work, is a certified trainer with Mental Health Works, and has worked for almost 3 decades in the mental health field. Renee has focused on community mental health services, mental health promotion, anti-stigma work, and on workplace mental health issues. Please welcome Renee.
Bonjour à tous et toutes. Nous félicitons la Commission ontarienne des droits de la personne pour le rapport sur la santé mentale et la toxicomanie parce qu'on importe, très important. Je sais que l'Association canadienne pour la santé mentale d'Ottawa a participé à vos consultations et était très fière de le faire. Je vais parler aujourd'hui comme gestionnaire travaillant avec des employés aux prises avec des problèmes de santé mentale ou toxicomanie. Je peux vous dire que je reste très optimiste face à la santé mentale au travail. Je fais beaucoup de travail dans ce domaine-là de nos jours à travers Mental Health Works, santé mentale au travail. Il y a 15 ans, on n'aurait jamais parlé de ça au niveau du travail, puis je reste optimiste qu'on va continuer à le faire. My focus today is around my experience as a manager and training managers to increase their knowledge and skills with regard to employees in distress, whether due to mental health or addiction issues, and their need to focus, the employer's focus, on solutions to keep employees at work by identifying their needs to be successful at work, whether it be informally negotiated or via legal accommodation. We know that talking about mental illness and mental health and increased knowledge and skills decreases stigma. We know that. I mean, stigma is due to that. We all know that. And it leads to changes in behaviors and hopefully decreases discrimination on a long-term basis. You know what I've learned about managers when I first started conducting training with many managers in this region? You know, you come in with the assumption that managers are not willing and are not concerned. But what I learned the most is that they have not learned the skills to talk to their employees who may be in distress or may be working with them and have mental health issues, and how to accommodate them in any way. So most managers are promoted for other skills. They're not promoted for interpersonal skills and communication skills, right? And so, except for me probably in many ways, but that puts me into trouble because with many of staff that I've had, I have to think I'm talking about health at work. I am not talking about health in your personal life. I'm listening, but my job is to deal with mental health at work. So, you know, they struggle. And they struggle, and I've heard so many managers struggle about, I'm pussyfooting here. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I'm frightened of violating people's privacy and rights, so therefore I don't say anything. Until often it's too late, and the outcome is the person is leaving work, and we know how difficult it is for people to return to work after mental health issues. So, The kinds of questions that managers ask me are, how do I ask about if I'm concerned with somebody? What do I say? What do I focus on? What behaviors do I need to know if somebody is getting ill, because I want to prevent illness and prevent performance issues before, right? And only the employees can tell us. So we need to have a balance between managers and employees, and in collaboration amongst employees and managers to be able to work on a work plan or accommodations that suit the employee. You know, fear of discrimination, I was saying, of invading people's privacy stops them from intervening before it's too late and people have left work. Often feeling that they're expected to be psychologists and psychiatrists, and again, that's not the case. You're there to listen as a manager and to discuss issues around how to keep the person successful at work. Many employers will say, if I only knew a person's diagnosis as an employee, wouldn't that be helpful? Well, we know that isn't helpful, and we really have to look more around, you know, what are the kinds of barriers that the employee may have that we can remove to continue at work. Fear on the part of employees is in disclosing what they need to be successful at work is also a major barrier. And we know that in 2008, the Canadian Medical Association came out with a research that said that only 23% of employees felt comfortable in talking to their managers around mental health issues. Well, that's got to improve and that's got to change. You know, barriers also include preconceived ideas like the one reported this week about depression from the Ipsos Reid Commission survey for Great West Life Mental Health Centre for mental health in the workplace, where over 6,000 working Canadians, including managers and employees, that means colleagues, believe that there should be a way to verify whether the employee is actually suffering from depression before giving them special consideration. And 2 out of 10 said depressed people can snap out of it if they really want to. So we've got some work to do around mental health in the workplace. You know, managers often believe that accommodations for employees with mental health issues are complicated or costly, when in fact they're not. Flexible work schedules, support and supervision at work, working at home, a quiet space, time for personal appointments, peer support, may be what's needed. In fact, that's what we all need as employees in many ways. Openness and disclosure with the permission and collaboration of employees, and discussing accommodation with colleagues whose jobs are affected also helps within the workplace. The team needs to work together. At CMHC Ottawa, we continue to learn about appropriate hiring practices for people with lived experience of mental health issues, to identify employee needs as they relate to their work. I have seen positive results once managers learned about mental health and illness, learn to communicate their concerns appropriately, and offer a supportive approach to employees they are concerned about, as well as work with employees to prevent such concerns. Nous avons beaucoup de travail à faire encore. Je reste optimiste que nous pouvons le faire un gestionnaire à la fois, un employé à la fois. Nous avons des enjeux face à nos cultures organisationnelles, augmenter les connaissances et les habiletés de nos gestionnaires, intégrer la santé mentale à nos comités de santé et sécurité et assurer une meilleure santé mentale au travail pour tout notre personnel. Merci.
Thank you, Renee. Before we open it up for questions, I need to say some thank yous. Firstly, to our partners, the team at the University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research and Education Centre. Thank you for partnering with us and making it possible for us to be here today. Lucy Lamarche, Sonia Negum, Michelle Phillips, has been running around doing the communications piece, and Jeanette Chatelain. Back there in the booth, French interpreters, Claire Breton-Pachla and Raymond Saint-Laurent, thank you. Sign language interpreters, Judy Settle and Brenda Jenkins, thank you. And Nancy Grinley, the captionist, thank you. And of course, our speakers, Bridget Renaud, Michelle Veillette, and Renee Ouimet. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience with us. As I said at the beginning, people around the world are having conversations today about mental health. In a sense, it reminds me of some comments that Barack Obama made before he became President of the United States when talking about race in America, and said, in order to deal with those issues, we have to have some difficult conversations. We have to sit down and talk about the experience, the barriers, the stigma, the discrimination, and have those conversations in a way that's based on respect. A lot of the behavior that we're talking about needing to change in institutions throughout our community is based on behavior and attitudes that have existed for a long, long time. But the fact that they've existed for a long, long time, I think, brings a sense of urgency to this issue, because we know that today many people continue to come up against barriers that prevent them from being full participants in the communities in which they live, contributing in the workplace to their families and their communities, to their ability, because of barriers, because of discrimination based on long-time behavior. So we need to urgently have those conversations, and I hope that the report and the work that will flow from it will help you in having those conversations, and that you'll pass it on, and that all of us will benefit from it, because certainly mental health and the barriers and discrimination related to it affects all of us, all of our families, all of our workplaces, all of our communities. And again, as I said earlier, although these are nice things to do, they're much, much more than that. They're required things to do. We're talking about the law, and the law says that people with mental health and addictions have human rights, and all of us have a role to play in ensuring that those rights that are written so well on the pieces of paper come off the paper and come alive and become lived rights for all Ontarians. Thank you to everyone, and let's go eat and talk and carry on the conversation. Thank you very much to all of you who are here and all of those on the web.